You probably clicked on this video because you're struggling with binge eating, and this is where I was just a year ago, where sometimes I would go upstairs and I would pretend to go to sleep. After my family and my brother had gone to sleep, I'd come back downstairs, grab a handful of chocolate, stuff it in my face. The next day I'd feel shameful about my behavior, pretend to be disciplined or try to be disciplined, and then the cycle would begin again. I remember bursting into tears at Costa Coffee with my mum, telling her that I was in this compulsive, addictive cycle of consistently overeating and I couldn't control it. But over the last 12 months, I did commit to making this change in my life, commit to changing my life, and I've learned a lot because I feel in control now, I feel free, I can go out for food, I don't binge anymore, and it's made me the happiest person I've ever been in my life. And it's flowing through to the rest of my life, my relationships, my health, my wealth, and I want to share that with you. And so in this video, I share with you actually the invisible hand that is shaping your behavior, because it's not about discipline, it's not about willpower. There's something else that is controlling your behavior that if you don't understand and you don't manipulate, then you will never change your life. And so I really encourage you just to lock in and focus for this video to understand the psychology of behavior change, because if you understand this, you will just be a happier person. You will achieve more with your life and you will feel better every single day. Let's get into it. So I need to tell you a story from 1971 in the Vietnam War. This is important because it tells us a lot about behavior change, which you'll understand in a second. So there were two congressmen that went to Vietnam during the war, and they visited the soldiers there and they discovered something pretty scary. They discovered that many of the soldiers were addicted to heroin. This information traveled back to President Nixon, who at the time was quite alarmed, and he announced the national emergency. He allocated an extra $155 million to the budget. And as part of that, he conducted extensive research on the soldiers that were entering back into the US after being in Vietnam, testing their urine for heroin. Now, as part of this research, a guy called Lee Robbins, who was leading it, conducted 900 interviews on these soldiers over 3 years. And he wanted to test whether these soldiers would stay addicted once they came back into the US. Because the interesting thing here is that the common belief prior to this moment was that heroin was an addiction that was permanent and irreversible. Because 90% of people, which is really scary, who go to rehab after being addicted to heroin, come out and relapse. People thought it was to do with self-control, people thought it was to do with willpower. In fact, people thought it was to do with morality. Like if you take heroin or you abuse drugs or alcohol, you're just a bad person. And many people still believe that today. And I think it's just fundamentally wrong once you understand what I'm going to share with you next. Because Lee Robbins found the complete opposite among the Vietnam soldiers. He found that only 12% of soldiers from Vietnam stayed addicted within a 3-year period. And what this tells us is that there was something different between the soldiers in Vietnam versus the guys that were addicted to heroin in the US. You see, in Vietnam, the soldiers were stressed, exhausted, they had access to heroin. So one of the soldiers that conducted the interviews mentioned that as he got off the plane, he got offered heroin by another soldier. So that's how available it was. But when they went back to the US, none of these triggers were there. And so because it wasn't available, because they weren't stressed, because they weren't exhausted, they didn't end up using. Whereas the guys that were addicted in the US, in their environment, there are multiple triggers. But then they go to rehab and those triggers aren't there. So they stop using. But then they go back to this environment and they continue using. And so one of the big revelations for me when I read this story was that the environment is shaping my behavior every single second. So let me tell you a story. Last year, it was around November time, and actually it was November 2024, I'd been in this cycle, I'd just eaten a crap load of cereal. I'd end up throwing the whole box into recycling because I'd finished it, because I didn't want my family to find out that I'd eaten the whole box. I'd gone to the gym because I'd dragged myself there because I just need to get out of this situation. And I was sitting on the cable row seated machine. This is the machine where you pull it close to you. And I was like, I need to change something. And I'd spent 2 months in Bali that year already. And I was like, okay, maybe I should just go and book a flight. And the rest of the day I pondered over it, I thought about it, and I was like, the next day I booked a flight and I went and I spent about a year there. And because I did that, I changed the environment so much that I didn't have any of the triggers and the cues that I have here. Like if I go to the kitchen here, it's surrounded by Indian food, Indian snacks, nuts, cereal, like all the stuff that usually makes me binge was there. But when I went away, I could control the environment around me. I didn't put anything in the fridge. I had healthy people around me. The availability of healthy food was great there. So it made it a lot easier for me to change my behavior. Now I understand that many of you won't be able to just book a flight to Bali and drop everything and go. And maybe you don't want to do that. But if you can control your environment at home, then it's going to make a massive difference, because it's going to stop you from having the triggers that cause your behavior in the first place. So I coach a guy and we've agreed that he's not going to buy those trigger foods. Like many of you will probably just have a few trigger foods that you like to eat, like crisps or bread or whatever it is. And if for at least a while you can just stop buying it, it's going to stop you from snowballing into that spiral where you just feel so full. Because that is the worst position, where you're just sitting there and you're like, why the fuck did I do that? Pardon my French. But when I got to Bali, it did make it a lot easier. But I didn't completely change, because there was still food available. With something like heroin, it's illegal, it's not that available. It's quite hard to just do everywhere. But food is generally quite acceptable. So even in Bali, there were things like dang cookies and crave cookies. I love my cookies, as you can tell. And I would order it late at night and I would just binge on these cookies and donuts and cereal again. And I would still continue to have the binges because it was there. And I realized that these moments were happening in specific internal states. And that's when I realized that it wasn't just my external environment that I needed to change, it was my internal environment. You see, the guys in Vietnam, their internal environment was stressed and exhausted, which meant that using heroin was like a remedy for that. And I realized for me, it was the same. I was unable to manage my stress and emotions, and so I would then binge on food. It's interesting because when I went on this entrepreneurial journey where I actually started to become a fitness coach, that was the exact time when the binging got worse, because I was initially working in a corporate job, and so that gave me structure. There was certainty of a salary. But then I got fired and I was thrust into this world of uncertainty and I just couldn't handle it. I remember getting onto the phone with this mentorship, and I was just trying to find out more, but then soon afterwards they somehow sold me and I ended up paying £6,800 over the phone for this mentorship, and I've never spent that amount of money in my life. As soon as I got off the phone, I was so overwhelmed that I went straight to the kitchen and had a binge. And so when I went to Bali, I realized that yes, okay, the external environment was easier to handle and I didn't have as many triggers. There were moments where I still felt stressed and I still had these emotions which were causing me to have binges, and I was like, right, I need to just get in control of my internal environment, and that's what I'm going to tell you how to do next. Because if you can control your internal environment, I guarantee it's going to make it so much easier not to overeat, because it is the internal triggers in our life that cause us to use food as a comfort which spiral into the binge. So how do we manage our internal environment? You need to understand that there are things that you can do in your life that will stop you from reacting to the internal triggers. And there's something called rituals. And I use the word rituals because it comes from the Latin ritus or ritus, which means rite or ceremony or custom. And those words, they hold weight. The language that we use tells the story about what our actions mean. If I just called my behaviors just actions that I do on a daily basis, it doesn't sound like it has gravitas. But when I say I have a ritual, it becomes something that is non-negotiable, and that becomes the foundation to being able to manage my internal environment. And so if you want to manage your internal environment, you need to have rituals. And for me, it looks like this, but for you, you have to experiment and design one that works for you. But for me, I have to manage two things. The first is sleep. There was a study done in 2004, and they did an experiment on a group of men, and they tested their appetite and their hormone levels for hunger and fullness after a short night of sleep, i.e. 4, 5, 6 hours, and then a normal length of sleep. And they found that there were actual hormone differences for their hunger and fullness after a short night's sleep. So when they had less sleep, they had less leptin and more ghrelin. Ghrelin is the hunger hormone and leptin is the fullness hormone. And so their hormones were different, so they had more of an appetite. They ate more calories. In fact, those calories were calorie dense and they were more carb heavy. And so if you don't manage your sleep, you will physiologically feel more hungry, and you're going to be fighting an uphill battle against your biology that, yeah, you might win once, you might win twice, but eventually it's going to snap. You can't fight your body. You have to respect your body, and that comes with ritualizing your sleep. And so for me, this looks like going to sleep at the same time every single day and waking up at the same time every single day, because I know that regularity matters. It means that I'm getting enough sleep every night. The other week I realized that I was drinking too much caffeine throughout the day. It was impacting my sleep. The next day I was more likely to have snacks. I was feeling like I was ruminating negatively. It was impacting my whole life. And so I immediately halved my caffeine consumption, because I realized that sleep is literally the foundation. If you don't have good sleep, everything falls to pot. So that's the first thing that I ritualize. And when I say ritual, I mean ritual. I literally am downstairs, I look on my phone, it becomes 8 p.m. I tell my brother and his fiance, and I say, look, it's 8 p.m, I'm going to sleep. And literally they're like just starting their evening. And I'm so disciplined around it now, because I know that if I don't get enough sleep, I am screwed. I am done for. I am eating the whole box of cereal again. And so you have to understand that having a bedtime and having a time to wake up is so important. In fact, you don't even need a time to wake up. You just need a bedtime. If you go to sleep at the same time every single day, then everything else falls into sleep. It's the most upstream behavior that you can have that will impact your rest of your life so powerfully. Number 2, training. So there was a study called the Florida Effect study. And it's a really interesting study because it shows the impact of this idea called priming. So they had 2 groups of people. Both groups of people, they got them to do word puzzles. And one of the groups, they showed words that were related to old age. So like Florida, wrinkly, that kind of thing. And the other group, they were just showed normal words. Then they were tested for how fast they would walk back from the main room to this other room that they had to go to after this word puzzle test. And the group that was shown words related to old age ended up walking back slower and more like old people. And this shows that we can prime our behavior. And so, yeah, I'm not showing myself words of self-control or willpower or discipline prior to the rest of my day, but I'm actually going to the gym and training really hard every single day without fail. Like even today, I really didn't want to go. Honestly, I really didn't want to go. I woke up, I was feeling a bit tired, I was feeling a bit unmotivated. The first half of the workout was awful. I was a bit distracted. I was taking like really long rest sessions, but I still went because it's a ritual. I have decided that showing up is a non-negotiable because it sets up the rest of my day. The other thing about training is that if you exhaust the body, you tame the mind. I'm naturally super distractible, super unfocused, super demotivated. I'm actually probably quite a lazy person naturally, but because I show up to the gym and I move my body, my mind becomes more clear, more focused, more settled, and that stops me from going and binging on snacks and distracting myself with cheap, instant comforts that are so available. It allows me to practice having self-control because I show up to the gym every single day, even when I don't want to. And so I'm proving to myself, I'm building an evidence to myself of like, oh my God, I'm someone that can do hard stuff even when I don't want to. And that flows through to the rest of my life. It primes me for the rest of the day when I do have access to the snacks and I do have access to the cereal and I do want to go open that cupboard and eat it because it tastes nice and it's really moreish, but I don't because I have power over my mind because I've proved it to myself first thing in the morning.